in the harsh mountains of Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory, where winter winds cut through a man's soul and justice often came at the end of a rope, there lived a boy who had never spoken a single word. The townsfolk called him worthless, a burden, to be passed from one cruel hand to another. They were about to discover that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truths, and that a father's love can reach even the most broken hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rocky peaks surrounding Cedar Ridge like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the sleeping valley below. In the cramped, windowless room above Sullivan's general store, 8-year-old Eli Carter sat perfectly still on a pile of burlap sacks, his thin frame barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. His clothes, little more than rags held together by hope and determination, hung loose on his undernourished body. But it was his eyes that told the real story, large, dark brown eyes that held depths of understanding far beyond his years. Eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Eli had been mute since birth, or so everyone believed. The truth was more complicated, buried beneath layers of trauma and abandonment that had taught him silence was safer than speech. In Cedar Ridge, where men's worth was measured by their ability to work hard and speak loud, a boy who couldn't do either was considered less than nothing. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden stairs outside his door made Eli's body tense. He knew those footsteps belonged to Frank Hayes, Big Bill Morrison's right-hand man. And Frank's arrival meant only one thing today was auction day. Eli pulled his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible, a survival technique he'd mastered during his short, difficult life. Frank burst through the door without ceremony, his weathered face twisted into its usual scowl. A man in his 40s with graying hair and tobacco-stained teeth, Frank had made a living out of other people's misery for as long as anyone could remember. "Up, boy," he growled, grabbing Eli roughly by the arm. "Boss wants you cleaned up and ready. We got buyers coming in from 3 counties today, and you're gonna fetch a good price if I have anything to say about it." Eli didn't resist as Frank dragged him to his feet. He'd learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. Instead, he focused on what he always did during these moments, observing everything around him with the intensity of someone whose survival depended on reading the smallest details. He noticed the new tear in Frank's shirt sleeve, the way the man favored his left leg after last week's fall from his horse, and the nervous energy that suggested even Frank was worried about something today. As they made their way down the narrow staircase, Eli caught a glimpse of the main street through a grimy window. Cedar Ridge was already coming to life despite the early hour. Miners heading off to work the claims in the nearby hills, shopkeepers opening their businesses, and the usual collection of drifters and fortune seekers who passed through the mountain town in search of easy money or a fresh start. But today was different. Even from his limited vantage point, Eli could see more activity than usual. Wagons he didn't recognize were parked along the main street, and men in expensive clothes, the kind worn by ranch owners and business operators, stood in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. These were the buyers Frank had mentioned. Men who came to Cedar Ridge's monthly auctions not for livestock or mining equipment, but for something far more valuable and far more heartbreaking: children. The Copper Creek auction house sat at the end of Main Street like a scar on the town's conscience. Built originally as a livestock auction facility, it had evolved over the years to serve a darker purpose. Children who had been orphaned, abandoned, or simply deemed unwanted by society were brought here to be sold to the highest bidder. The buyers told themselves they were providing opportunities, giving these children homes and work. The reality was far more brutal. Most of these children would spend their lives as unpaid laborers, working dangerous jobs in mines, on ranches, or in factories until their bodies gave out or accidents claimed them. Big Bill Morrison ran the operation with the cold efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped seeing his merchandise as human beings. A massive figure with a belly that strained against his expensive vest and a voice that could be heard 3 blocks away. Morrison had built his fortune on the backs of the desperate and the defenseless. He stood now on the auction house steps, gold pocket watch in hand, timing the arrival of potential buyers with the precision of a military commander. Frank pushed Eli toward a group of other children huddled near the auction house's side entrance. There were 12 of them in total, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15, all wearing the same hollow expression of those who had learned not to hope for better. Eli recognized most of them from previous auctions, children who had been returned by dissatisfied buyers who had somehow survived their placements only to find themselves back on the market. There was Lucy, a girl of maybe 10 with matted blonde hair and a persistent cough that buyers always noticed and worried about. Next to her stood the Martinez twins, brothers who refused to be separated despite Morrison's attempts to sell them individually. An older boy named Pete, whose left arm hung useless at his side from an old mining accident, sat apart from the others, his face set in the grim acceptance of someone who knew his chances of being chosen were slim. "Listen up, you worthless lot," Frank announced, his voice cutting through the morning air like a rusty blade. "Today's your lucky day. We got buyers with deep pockets and real opportunities waiting inside. But if any of you embarrass Mr. Morrison or make trouble, you'll wish you'd never been born. You understand me?" The children nodded silently, a choreographed response born from experience and fear. All except Eli, who simply stared at Frank with those dark, knowing eyes. The man's face reddened with irritation. "You deaf as well as mute, boy?" he snarled, raising his hand as if to strike. Before the blow could fall, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "That'll be enough of that, Hayes." Everyone turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the main street. He was tall but not imposing, lean, in the way of someone who worked hard for his living, but didn't rely on size or bluster to make his point. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who spent his days under the open sky. But it was his eyes that made the strongest impression, blue as a summer sky and filled with a quiet strength that suggested depths of character rarely seen in Cedar Ridge. Jake Thompson had arrived in town 3 days earlier, driving a small herd of cattle to sell at the regular livestock auction. A rancher from the eastern part of the territory, he ran a modest operation called the Circle T Ranch, with the help of a few hired hands and an unshakable belief that hard work and honest dealing would see a man through any difficulty. He had planned to complete his business and head home by now, but something had kept him in Cedar Ridge longer than intended. That something was the knowledge of what happened at the Copper Creek auction house on the last Saturday of every month. Jake had heard rumors, of course, in a territory where news traveled slowly and often grew in the telling. Stories of children being sold like livestock had reached even his remote ranch. But he had dismissed them as exaggerations, the kind of tall tales that frontier towns were famous for. It wasn't until he'd seen the preparations with his own eyes, witnessed Morrison's men gathering children like cattle for market, that the horrible truth had sunk in. "This is none of your concern, Thompson," Frank growled, his hand still raised threateningly over Eli. "These children are Mr. Morrison's property, legal and proper. Got papers on every one of them." Jake stepped closer, his movement casual but purposeful. He was armed, a Colt revolver hung from his belt with the natural ease of a man who knew how to use it, but his hands remained relaxed at his sides. "Papers or not, I don't take kindly to seeing grown men threaten children, particularly children who can't defend themselves." His eyes swept over the group of assembled children, taking in their ragged clothes, their too thin faces, and the way they instinctively huddled together for protection. When his gaze fell on Eli, something passed between them, a moment of recognition that transcended words. Jake saw intelligence in those dark eyes, saw the way the boy observed everything with the intense focus of someone whose survival depended on reading people and situations correctly. "You got business here, mister." Morrison's booming voice announced his arrival as the big man descended the auction house steps like a king approaching his throne. "Because if you ain't buying, I suggest you move along. We got work to do." Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was polite but not deferential. "Jake Thompson, Circle T Ranch. I heard you might have some children looking for work opportunities. Thought I might take a look." Morrison's demeanor changed. Instantly, the way a merchant always did when faced with a potential customer. "Well now, that's different entirely. Frank, get these children cleaned up and ready for inspection. Mr. Thompson here might be interested in making an investment in his future workforce." As Frank began herding the children toward the auction house, Jake fell into step beside Morrison. "What can you tell me about that boy there?" he asked, nodding toward Eli. "The quiet one." Morrison followed his gaze, and his expression soured slightly. "That's Eli Carter. Been through here 3 times now. Can't speak a word, mute as a post. Buyers keep bringing him back, claiming he's no good for anything. Honestly, I'm starting to think he might be simple in the head too." Jake watched as Eli helped Lucy, the girl with the cough, navigate the auction house steps. The boy's movements were gentle and careful, showing a concern for others that seemed remarkable given his circumstances. "He looks observant enough to—" Jake said quietly. "Maybe," Morrison replied with a shrug. "But what good is observation if you can't follow orders or communicate what you've seen?" Boy's 8 years old and never spoken a word. Most buyers want children who can at least answer when they're called. The interior of the Copper Creek auction house was even more depressing than its exterior suggested. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What had once been a legitimate business facility had been transformed into something that resembled a slave market more than anything else. Rough wooden benches provided seating for buyers, while a raised platform at the front of the room served as the auction block where children would be displayed like prize cattle. Jake took a seat near the back, close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid immediate association with the other buyers. As he looked around the room, he felt his stomach turn at what he saw. These weren't desperate families looking to adopt children out of love. These were hard-faced men calculating the potential profit to be made from young bodies and broken spirits. There was Marcus Webb, a mine owner from the northern camps who was known for working children in dangerous conditions for 12 hours a day. Next to him sat the Hartwell brothers, who ran a series of factories in Denver and had a reputation for caring more about production quotas than worker safety. In the front row, a man Jake didn't recognize but instantly disliked was examining what appeared to be a catalog of available children, making notes in the margins like he was shopping for farm equipment. The children were brought out in groups, forced to stand on the platform while Morrison described their supposed qualifications and starting bids. Jake watched in growing horror as boys and girls were paraded before the crowd, their worth reduced to their ability to work dangerous jobs or perform household labor without complaint. When Eli's turn came, the boy walked to the platform with his head held high despite everything that had been done to break his spirit. He stood perfectly still as Morrison began his pitch, but Jake could see the way his eyes moved constantly, cataloging faces, exits, and potential threats with the efficiency of a seasoned survivor. "This here's Eli Carter," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the false enthusiasm of a snake oil salesman. 8 years old, good health despite appearances, and quiet as a church mouse. "Now I'll be honest with you gentlemen, the boy can't speak. But what he lacks in conversation, he makes up for in obedience. He won't talk back, won't complain about working conditions, and won't cause trouble in your operations." A voice From the crowd called out, "What's wrong with him? Why can't he talk?" Morrison shrugged. Born that way, near as anyone can tell, could be a blessing in disguise for the right buyer. Sometimes the quiet ones work the hardest. Jake felt something twist in his chest as he watched Eli standing there, subjected to the cold evaluation of men who saw him as nothing more than potential profit. The boy's face remained carefully neutral, but Jake caught a glimpse of something else in those dark eyes, a flicker of defiance that suggested Eli Carter was far from broken, no matter what had been done to him. The bidding began slowly. Marcus Webb opened with a low offer, clearly interested but not wanting to seem too eager. The Hartwell brothers countered, and for several minutes the price climbed in small increments. Jake remained silent, studying not just Eli but the entire proceeding, his anger building with each callous comment from the bidders. "Mighty quiet back there, Thompson," Morrison called out, noticing Jake's lack of participation. "This boy not catching your interest?" Jake stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Every eye in the room turned to him, including Eli's. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, man and boy looked at each other across the crowded auction house, and Jake saw something in Eli's expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not hope exactly, but a kind of cautious recognition, as if the child sensed that here, finally, was someone different. "I'll take him," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Name your price." Morrison's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Well now, that's more like it. Current bid is $15. You offering 20? "I'm offering 50, Jake replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Cash money right now, with the understanding that this child comes with me today, and no one else gets to bid." The auction house erupted in surprised murmurs. $50 was more than most children brought at auction, enough to buy good quality livestock or a month's supplies for a mining operation. Morrison's eyes lit up with avarice, but he tried to maintain his professional composure. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Thompson, but we do have other interested parties. Perhaps we should let the bidding continue and see where." $50. Jake repeated, stepping forward and placing a small leather pouch on the nearest bench. The coins inside clinked together with a sound that somehow managed to cut through all other noise in the room. "Final offer. Take it or leave it." Morrison looked around the room, reading the faces of his other customers. $50 was good money, more than he'd expected to get for a mute child who'd already been returned 3 times. And there was something in Jake Thompson's manner that suggested he wasn't a man to be trifled with. "Sold," Morrison announced, banging his gavel with theatrical flourish. "Eli Carter goes to Mr. Thompson of the Circle T Ranch for $50 cash." As the crowd began to disperse and attention turned to the next child on the auction block, Jake walked to the platform where Eli still stood. Up close, the boy looked even smaller and more fragile, but those dark eyes remained alert and intelligent. Jake extended his hand, not in the gesture of an owner claiming property, but in the way one person greets another. "Hello, Eli," he said softly. "My name's Jake Thompson. I've got a ranch about 2 days' ride from here, and I could use some help with the horses. They seem to like quiet folks." "What do you say?" Eli stared at the offered hand for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. In his short life, every adult hand extended toward him had brought pain, disappointment, or betrayal. But something about Jake Thompson felt different. Maybe it was the way he'd spoken to Eli directly instead of talking about him like he wasn't there. Maybe it was the genuine warmth in those blue eyes, or the careful way he held himself strong, but not threatening. Slowly, carefully, Eli reached out and took Jake's hand. His small fingers disappeared into the rancher's calloused palm, but the grip was gentle and steady. For the first time in months, Eli Carter allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. As Jake led him toward the auction house exit, Eli glanced back once at the other children still waiting their turn on the platform. Lucy caught his eye and managed a small smile despite her fear. The Martinez twins nodded solemnly, and even Pete raised his good hand in a gesture of farewell. They were happy for him, Eli realized, even though his good fortune did nothing to improve their own prospects. Outside, the Colorado mountain air felt cleaner somehow, as if the weight of the auction house had been pressing down on everyone inside, without them realizing it. Jake's horse, a sturdy bay gelding, was tied to the hitching post alongside a pack mule loaded with supplies. The animals turned their heads as Jake and Eli approached, and Eli was surprised to see genuine gentleness in their eyes. "This here's Scout," Jake said, patting the horse's neck affectionately. "He's been with me for 6 years now, smart as they come and steady as a rock." The mule's called Biscuit on account of his color and his tendency to steal any food that's not tied down properly. Eli reached out tentatively to touch Scout's muzzle, half expecting the animal to shy away or snap at him. Instead, the horse nuzzled his palm gently, as if sensing that here was someone who had been hurt and needed kindness. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Eli felt the corners of his mouth turn up in something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Jake watched this interaction with growing certainty that he had made the right decision. There was something special about this boy, something that went far beyond his inability to speak. The way he moved with such careful observation, the intelligence that shone in his dark eyes, and now this natural connection with the animals, all of it suggested that Eli Carter was far more than the worthless burden the people of Cedar Ridge believed him to be. "We'll get you some proper clothes and a good meal before we head out," Jake said, helping Eli up onto Scout's back. "Mrs. Davis at the boarding house makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, and I have a feeling you haven't had decent food in quite a while." As they rode slowly through Cedar Ridge's main street, Eli found himself seeing the town from an entirely new perspective. For the first time in his life, he wasn't walking with his head down, trying to avoid notice. Instead, he sat straight in the saddle, looking around with open curiosity at the world that had always seemed so hostile and unwelcoming. People stared as they passed, some with surprise at seeing the mute boy from the auction house riding alongside Jake Thompson, others with the kind of knowing looks that suggested they understood exactly what transaction had just taken place. But for once, Eli didn't feel the weight of their judgment. Whatever happened next, whatever this Jake Thompson expected from him, it had to be better than what he was leaving behind. As they approached the edge of town, Jake pointed toward the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks already touched with early snow despite the season. "That's where we're headed," he said. "The Circle T Ranch sits in a valley between those 2 peaks there, Eagle's Rest and Morning Star. It's not much to look at from the outside, but it's home. And as of today, Eli Carter, it's your home too." Eli followed Jake's gesture, trying to imagine what lay beyond those imposing mountains. A ranch, Jake had said, with horses that liked quiet people. The concept of having a home, a real home, was so foreign to Eli that he could barely wrap his mind around it. But as Scout's steady gait carried them away from Cedar Ridge and toward whatever future awaited them, Eli Carter allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in years. He allowed himself to hope. The journey to Circle T Ranch took 2 full days through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country Eli had ever seen. They followed winding mountain trails that seemed to disappear into the clouds, crossed rushing streams fed by melting snow, and camped under stars so bright they looked like scattered diamonds against black velvet. For Eli, who had spent most of his life in the cramped confines of Cedar Ridge's buildings and back alleys, the vastness of the wilderness was both terrifying and magnificent. Jake proved to be a patient traveling companion, never pushing the pace beyond what Scout and Biscuit could comfortably maintain. and always making sure Eli was secure in the saddle before they tackled any particularly challenging terrain. He spoke often during their journey, not expecting responses but seeming to understand that his voice provided comfort and continuity in quote and foodie, what must have been an overwhelming experience for the boy. That peak there with the white cap, Jake said. On their first afternoon, pointing to a towering mountain that seemed to scrape the sky itself. The Ute Indians call it Sleeping Bear Mountain. Legend says a great bear once lived up there, so large he could reach down and drink from the valleys below. When winter came, he'd curl up and sleep, and his breath would turn to snow that covered the land until spring woke him again. Eli listened intently to these stories, filing away every detail with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to survive by remembering everything. Jake's voice had a soothing quality, warm and steady like a campfire on a cold night, and gradually Eli began to relax in ways he hadn't known were possible. Their first night camping under the stars revealed more about Jake Thompson's character than hours of conversation might have accomplished. When Eli hesitated at the edge of their small campfire, clearly uncertain whether he was welcome to share its warmth, Jake simply patted the ground beside him and continued preparing their evening meal as if having the boy join him was the most natural thing in the world. The food itself was a revelation. Where Eli was accustomed to stale bread, watery soup, and whatever scraps he could scavenge, Jake produced thick slices of bacon, beans seasoned with molasses, and coffee so rich it seemed like liquid strength. When he noticed Eli eating with the desperate speed of someone who expected his meal to be taken away at any moment, Jake slowed his own pace and kept the conversation flowing to help the boy relax. "Tomorrow we'll reach Eagle's Rest Pass," Jake said, settling back against his saddle with his coffee cup in hand. "It's the highest point on our route, and from there you'll be able to see the ranch for the first time. My spread isn't the biggest in the territory, but it's got good grass, clean water, and enough room for a man to breathe properly. Been building it up for 8 years now, ever since I mustered out of the army." The mention of military service caught Eli's attention, and Jake noticed the increased focus in the boy's dark eyes. "Served with the cavalry for 12 years, he continued, stirring the fire with a long stick. "Saw action in the Indian Wars, spent time at frontier posts from Montana to New Mexico. Learned a lot about surviving in harsh country, about reading people and situations, about the difference between necessary violence and the kind that just feeds on itself." Something in Jake's tone suggested deeper stories, experiences that had shaped him in fundamental ways. Eli sensed that this man understood what it meant to see too much, to carry burdens that were too heavy for one person to bear alone. It was part of what made Jake different from other adults Eli had known, part of what made his kindness feel genuine rather than calculated. As the fire burned lower and the mountain air grew colder, Jake pulled an extra blanket from his pack and wrapped it around Eli's thin shoulders. "Get some rest, son," he said quietly. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day for both of us." The word son hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Eli had never been called that before, had never experienced the particular kind of warmth that came from being claimed and protected by an adult. He pulled the blanket closer around himself and found that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt safe enough to truly sleep. The second day of their journey brought new challenges and new revelations. The trail grew steeper and more demanding as they climbed toward Eagle's Rest Pass, and Jake dismounted to walk alongside Scout, giving the horses back a rest while ensuring that Eli remained secure in the saddle. The boy was impressed by this consideration for the animal's welfare, another small but significant detail that spoke to Jake's character. When they finally crested the pass in the early afternoon, Eli's breath caught in his throat at the sight that greeted them. Spread out in the valley below was a landscape of such pristine beauty it seemed like something from a dream. Rolling Meadows green with spring grass stretched between groves of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered silver in the mountain breeze. A clear stream wound through the center of the valley like a ribbon of liquid crystal, and scattered across the pastures were cattle bearing the Circle T brand. But it was the ranch buildings themselves that truly captured Eli's attention. Unlike the rough, hastily constructed structures he was accustomed to seeing in mining towns, these buildings spoke of permanence and careful craftsmanship. The main house was built of logs that had been chinked and weatherproofed with obvious skill, its windows genuine glass rather than oiled paper or open holes. A large barn stood nearby, its doors wide enough to accommodate loaded wagons, and various outbuildings suggested a working ranch that was both practical and prosperous. "There she is," Jake said with unmistakable pride in his voice. "The Circle T Ranch. Not much compared to some of the big spreads down in Texas, but every board and stone of it was put in place with honest work and clear intentions." As they began their descent into the valley, Eli noticed movement near the barn. 3 men had emerged from the building and were shading their eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to identify the approaching riders. Even at a distance, their posture suggested the easy alertness of people who were comfortable with their surroundings, but ready for whatever might come their way. "That'll be Sam, Pete, and Cookie," Jake explained, following Eli's gaze. "My ranch hands and probably the best men I've ever had the privilege of working alongside. They've been running things while I was away, and knowing them, everything's in better shape now than when I left." The first man to reach them as they rode into the ranch yard was Sam Rodriguez, a compact, weathered man in his 30s whose dark eyes missed nothing. He moved with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable on horseback or on foot, and when he smiled, the expression transformed his serious face entirely. "Jake," Sam called out, reaching up to take Scout's reins. As Jake dismounted, "How'd the cattle sale go? And who's this young fellow you've brought home with you?" Jake placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder as he helped him down from the saddle. "Sam, I'd like you to meet Eli Carter. He's going to be staying with us for a while, learning about ranch work and maybe helping out with the horses. Eli, this is Sam Rodriguez, my foreman and the man who keeps this place running when I'm away." Sam extended his hand toward Eli with the same natural courtesy Jake had shown at the auction house, as if greeting a new ranch hand rather than a purchased child. "Pleased to meet you, Eli. Hope you're ready to work hard and learn fast, because we've got plenty of both around here." Eli shook Sam's hand solemnly, noting the man's firm but gentle grip and the genuine welcome in his dark eyes. It was already clear that Jake's kindness wasn't an isolated trait, but part of the culture he had created at the Circle T Ranch. The second man to approach was Pete Wilson, a tall, lanky individual with prematurely gray hair and hands that spoke of decades spent working with tools and leather. Despite his serious expression, there was something fundamentally trustworthy about Pete, a steadiness that suggested he could be counted on in any crisis. "This is Pete," Jake continued with the introductions. "Best horse trainer in 3 counties. And a man who can fix anything that's broken, whether it's made of wood, metal, or stubborn animal flesh." Pete nodded at Eli with quiet approval. "Good to have you here, son. Always room for another pair of hands around this place, and Jake's got a good eye for potential." The third man was older than the others, somewhere in his 60s, with a white beard that reached nearly to his belt and eyes that twinkled with barely suppressed mischief. Despite his age, he moved with surprising energy, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "And this distinguished gentleman," Jake said with obvious affection, "is Cookie Murphy, the best cook in the Colorado Territory and a man who's probably forgotten more about surviving in wild country than most people ever learn." Cookie looked Eli up and down with the appraising eye of someone who had spent decades feeding hungry men and making sure they stayed healthy enough to work. "Skinny as a fence post," he announced with characteristic bluntness. Gonna take some serious cooking to put proper meat on those bones. Good thing I just pulled a pot roast out of the oven and made extra biscuits." The mention of food made Eli's stomach rumble audibly, earning chuckles from all the men. But rather than embarrassment, their laughter conveyed warmth and understanding, as if they all remembered what it was like to be young and hungry and far from home. "Let's get you settled in first," Jake said, shouldering Eli's small bundle of possessions along with his own saddlebags. "You can clean up, get some proper clothes that fit, and then we'll see about filling that empty stomach of yours." Jake led Eli toward the main house, and as they walked, Eli found himself taking note of dozens of small details that spoke to the character of the place and its owner. The ranch yard was neat, but not obsessively so, suggesting people who took pride in their work without being slaves to appearances. The various animals he could see, horses in the corral, cattle in the near pasture, even a few chickens pecking around the barn, all looked healthy and well cared for. The interior of the main house was even more impressive than its exterior had suggested. The main room was spacious and comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture that showed both skill and careful attention to detail. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with simple but meaningful objects: a pair of Army cavalry spurs, a framed daguerreotype of a stern-looking couple who might have been Jake's parents, and a collection of books that suggested their owner was better educated than many frontier ranchers. "This will be your room," Jake said, opening a door off the main room to reveal a small but comfortable space. The room contained a real bed with a proper mattress, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a mirror, and a window that looked out over the valley. For Eli, who had spent most of his life sleeping on floors or in corners, the luxury was almost overwhelming. Jake seemed to understand the boy's reaction without needing words to explain it. "I know it's probably different from what you're used to," he said quietly. "But this is your space now, Eli. Your room, your bed, your place to keep whatever belongings you want to collect. Nobody's going to take it away from you, and nobody's going to make you leave unless you choose to go." The concept of ownership, of having something that belonged to him and couldn't be taken away on a whim, was so foreign to Eli that he could barely process it. He moved to the window and looked out at the valley spread below, trying to convince himself that this wasn't some elaborate dream that would evaporate the moment he allowed himself to believe in it. Jake left him alone for a few minutes to let the reality sink in, returning with an armload of clothes that looked like they would actually fit. "These belong to my nephew," he explained, setting the clothes on the bed. "He stayed here for a summer a few years back, and he's about your size. They should do until we can get to town and buy you some things of your own." The clothes were simple but well-made wool pants, cotton shirts, a warm jacket, and sturdy boots that looked like they'd seen some use but still had plenty of life left in them. To Eli, they represented luxury beyond his previous imagination, and Jake noticed the careful way he touched the fabric, as if he couldn't quite believe these things were meant for him. "Get cleaned up and changed," Jake said, indicating the washstand where fresh water waited in a ceramic pitcher. "Take your time, and when you're ready, come on out to the kitchen. Cookie's pot roast waits for no man, and I suspect you're going to want to try those biscuits while they're still warm." Left alone in his new room, Eli moved slowly to the washstand and began the process of cleaning away the grime and desperation of his old life. The water was warm, the soap was real, rather than the harsh lime mixture he was accustomed to, and for the first time in months, he was able to wash without worrying about being interrupted or having his privacy violated. As he changed into the clean clothes, Eli caught sight of himself in the mirror above the washstand. The boy looking back at him was still thin and marked by hardship, but there was something different in his dark eyes, a spark of possibility that hadn't been there before. The clothes fit well enough, and more importantly, they made him look like a normal child rather than a piece of unwanted property. When he finally emerged from his room, the smell of Cookie's cooking drew him like a magnet toward the kitchen. The old cook was bustling around a massive wood-burning stove, tending to multiple pots and pans with the orchestrated precision of a military commander managing a campaign. Jake and the other men were already seated around a large wooden table, waiting patiently for their meal and talking quietly among themselves about ranch business. "There's our boy," Cookie announced as Eli appeared in the doorway. "Looking considerably more human now that he's clean and properly dressed. Take a seat anywhere you like, son. Food's just about ready." Eli hesitated for a moment, uncertain where he belonged in this gathering of men who had accepted him so readily into their circle. Jake noticed his uncertainty and patted the chair beside him. "Right here, Eli. Best seat in the house for watching Cookie work his magic." As Eli took his place at the table, Cookie began serving a meal that exceeded anything the boy had ever imagined possible. The pot roast was tender enough to cut with a fork, accompanied by potatoes, carrots, and onions that had absorbed the rich flavors of the meat. The biscuits were golden brown and fluffy, perfect vehicles for the honey that Cookie produced from a ceramic jar. There were green beans seasoned with bacon, cornbread with real butter, and coffee that filled the kitchen with its aromatic promise of warmth and energy. But more than the food itself, it was the atmosphere around the table that truly amazed Eli. These men talked and laughed together like a family, sharing stories of their day's work, making plans for tomorrow's tasks, and including Eli in their conversation as if he had always been part of their circle. Nobody seemed to find his silence strange or troubling, and when Sam asked him a direct question about his journey from Cedar Ridge, Jake smoothly redirected the conversation without making Eli feel excluded or inadequate. "Tomorrow," Jake said, as the meal wound down and Cookie began clearing the dishes, "I thought we'd start by showing Eli around the ranch properly. Let him get a feel for how we do things here. Maybe see if he has any natural inclination toward working with the animals." Pete nodded approvingly. "Got a new mare that came in yesterday, gentle as a lamb but skittish around most folks. Might be interesting to see how she reacts to the boy." Sam leaned back in his chair and studied Eli with thoughtful eyes. "You ever work around horses before, Eli?" For a moment, Eli considered trying to communicate through gestures or expressions, but something about the honest interest in Sam's face made him simply nod his head. It was true, in a limited sense, he had helped care for the few horses that passed through Cedar Ridge, and he had always felt more comfortable around animals than around most people. "That's good," Sam continued. "Horses are honest creatures. They don't lie or pretend to be something they're not, and they respond to genuine kindness better than almost any other animal. I suspect you and they are going to get along just fine." As the evening progressed and the men settled into the comfortable routines of ranch life, Eli found himself experiencing emotions he had no names for. For the first time in his memory, he was part of something larger than himself, something that functioned on principles of mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than fear and domination. Jake and his men worked together because they chose to, because they had built something worth preserving and protecting. When bedtime finally arrived and Jake walked into his new room, Eli felt a combination of exhaustion and nervous energy that made sleep seem impossible. Jake seemed to understand this as well, settling into the chair beside the bed with the easy patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "I know this is all pretty overwhelming," Jake said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. In the darkened room, "You've been through more changes in the last few days than most people experience in months. It's natural to feel uncertain about what comes next." Eli listened intently, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of Jake's voice and the genuine concern it conveyed. Outside his window, he could hear the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling in for the night horses moving quietly in their corral, the distant lowing of cattle, and the whisper of wind through the aspen groves. "I want you to know," Jake continued, that there are no expectations here beyond what you're comfortable with. You're not a servant or a piece of property or anything else except a boy who deserves a chance at a better life. We'll teach you what we can about ranch work if you're interested, but mostly we just want you to feel safe and to remember what it's like to be a child." The word child resonated through Eli's consciousness like a bell tolling in the distance. For so long, he had been forced to think and act like an adult, to navigate dangers and make survival decisions that no 8-year-old should have to face. The idea that he might be allowed to simply be young, to learn and grow without the constant pressure of life or death consequences, was both terrifying and wonderful. As Jake's quiet voice continued, telling stories of the ranch's history and the adventures that had led to its creation, Eli felt his eyelids growing heavy. For the first time in years, he was drifting off to sleep not from exhaustion, but from contentment, surrounded by warmth and safety and the promise of tomorrow's possibilities. The last thing he remembered before sleep claimed him was Jake's gentle voice saying, "Sweet dreams, son. Tomorrow we start building your new life." Eli's first morning at Circle T Ranch dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the sound of birdsong, replacing the harsh voices that had usually awakened him in Cedar Ridge. For several confused moments, he lay perfectly still in the comfortable bed, trying to reconcile the softness of clean sheets and the warmth of wool blankets with his memories of cold floors and scratchy burlap sacks. The gentle knock on his door reminded him that yesterday hadn't been a dream. Jake's voice, warm and unhurried, called through the wood. "Morning, Eli. Breakfast is ready when you are, but take your time getting dressed. No rush here." The concept of no rush was as foreign to Eli as the comfortable bed had been. Throughout his short life, every morning had begun with urgent demands, harsh commands, and the constant pressure to move faster, work harder, and stay out of the way. The idea that he could take his time, that someone would wait patiently for him to be ready, was almost incomprehensible. He dressed quickly, in his new clothes, still marveling at how they fit properly and didn't smell of other people's sweat and desperation. When he emerged from his room, he found Jake sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reading what appeared to be a letter. The rancher looked up with a genuine smile that reached his blue eyes. "Sleep well?" Jake asked, setting the letter aside. "I know everything's pretty different here from what you're used to. Takes time to adjust to new places and new people." Cookie was already bustling around the kitchen, preparing what smelled like another feast. The old cook glanced over his shoulder at Eli and nodded approvingly. "Good, you're up. Got flapjacks on the griddle, bacon in the pan, and eggs from our own chickens. Real eggs, mind you, not the store-bought things that taste like nothing." As Eli took his place at the table, Sam Rodriguez appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands and his dark hair still damp from washing. "Morning, Jake, Eli." He nodded to both of them with equal courtesy. "Checked the horses already. That new mare we talked about yesterday is settling in well, but she's still a bit nervous around most of us. Thought maybe after breakfast, Eli. Might like to meet her." The suggestion sent a thrill of anticipation through Eli's chest. He had always felt more comfortable around animals than people, finding their honesty and directness easier to understand than the complex motivations and hidden agendas that seem to drive most human interactions. The possibility of working with horses, of being trusted with their care, represented something he had never dared to hope for. Jake noticed the boy's increased attention and smiled. "What do you think, Eli? Want to spend some time in the corral this morning, see how you get along with our four-legged residents?" Eli nodded eagerly, the first truly animated response Jake had seen from him since their first meeting at the auction house. The simple enthusiasm in that gesture told Jake more about the boy's interests and potential than hours of conversation might have revealed. After breakfast, Jake led Eli out to the horse corral, a large enclosure built of sturdy pine logs that had been carefully fitted together to create a space that was both secure and spacious. Several horses moved about the enclosure with the easy grace of animals that were well cared for and comfortable in their surroundings. But it was the horse standing apart from the others that immediately caught Eli's attention. She was a beautiful chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face and 3 white socks on her legs. Her coat gleamed with health, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. But there was something else there too, a wariness, a hesitation that spoke of experiences that had taught her to be careful around people. "That's Bella," Jake said quietly, following Eli's gaze. "She came to us from a ranch up north where the owner died suddenly. His nephew inherited the place, but didn't know much about horses. By the time we got her, she'd been neglected for months. Not abused exactly, but forgotten. Left to fend for herself in a pasture with barely enough grass to keep her alive." Sam joined them at the corral fence, his weathered hands resting on the top rail. "She's healthy enough now, thanks to Cookie's special grain mixture and Pete's patient care, but she's lost trust in people. Can't blame her, really. Takes time to rebuild that kind of confidence." Eli watched Bella with intense focus, noting the way she held herself slightly apart from the other horses, the alertness in her posture that suggested she was constantly ready to flee, and the occasional glances she cast toward the humans gathered at the fence. He recognized something of himself in her wariness, in her careful observation of every movement and sound around her. Without thinking about it, Eli began to move slowly along the fence line, not approaching Bella directly, but simply positioning himself where she could see him clearly without feeling threatened. His movements were fluid and non-threatening, the instinctive behavior of someone who understood what it meant to be frightened and alone. Jake and Sam exchanged glances, both recognizing something significant in the boy's approach. Most people, when introduced to a nervous horse, made the mistake of trying to approach too quickly or directly, often making the situation worse through their impatience or misunderstanding of animal psychology. But Eli seemed to grasp intuitively that trust had to be earned gradually through consistency and respect rather than force or dominance. For nearly an hour, Eli simply stood at the fence, sometimes moving slowly to different positions, but never making any aggressive moves toward Bella or the other horses. He seemed content to simply observe, to let the animals become accustomed to his presence without demanding anything from them. Gradually, the other horses began to accept his presence, occasionally wandering over to investigate this quiet newcomer who radiated calm rather than the nervous energy that often characterized human visitors. A gentle old gelding named Murphy was the first to approach, extending his neck over the fence to sniff delicately at Eli's outstretched hand. Eli remained perfectly still as Murphy investigated him, allowing the horse to satisfy his curiosity, without any sudden movements that might startle him. When Murphy finally decided that this new person was acceptable, he allowed Eli to stroke his soft nose, rumbling with pleasure at the gentle contact. The interaction with Murphy seemed to reassure the other horses, and gradually several more approached the fence where Eli stood. Each horse was greeted with the same patient respect, the same gentle touch, and the same understanding that they were individuals with their own personalities and preferences. But throughout all of these interactions, Eli's attention kept returning to Bella, who remained at the far side of the corral, watching but not approaching. He could see the curiosity in her dark eyes, the way she occasionally took a step or two in his direction before stopping and retreating. It was a dance of approach and avoidance that spoke to the careful balancing act that trust required. Pete Wilson appeared at the corral just as the sun reached its zenith, carrying a bucket of oats and wearing his usual expression of quiet competence. He nodded to Jake and Sam, then studied the scene before him with the experienced eye of someone who had spent decades working with horses. "Well, I'll be," Pete said softly, watching as Murphy continued to nuzzle Eli's hand. Haven't seen Murphy take to someone that quickly since Jake first brought him home. Usually takes him weeks to warm up to new people. Jake smiled, pleased but not entirely surprised by what he was witnessing. Eli seems to have a natural way with them. Look at how he's positioning himself, how he's letting them come to him instead of trying to force interactions. Sam nodded in agreement. And see how he keeps checking on Bella without making her feel pressured? That's real horse sense right there. Can't teach that kind of understanding. It's something you're born with. As if she had heard her name mentioned, Bella raised her head and looked directly at Eli for a long moment. Something passed between them and that look, a recognition of shared experience and mutual understanding. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she began to move toward the fence where Eli stood. The other men held their breath, recognizing the significance of the moment. Bella hadn't approached any of them voluntarily since her arrival at the ranch, despite weeks of patient effort on their part. For her to choose to approach this boy she had only just met suggested something extraordinary about Eli's natural connection with animals. Bella stopped just out of reach, her neck extended toward Eli, but her body still positioned for quick retreat if necessary. Eli remained perfectly still, allowing her to take all the time she needed to make her decision. When she finally took the last few steps that brought her within touching distance, he slowly extended his hand, palm up, letting her investigate his scent and intentions at her own pace. The moment when Bella's soft muzzle touched Eli's palm was electric with possibility. Her touch was gentle, questioning, and when Eli responded by barely moving his fingers to stroke her nose, she didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to relax slightly, some of the tension leaving her posture as she allowed this quiet boy to make contact. For several minutes, they stood like that, boy and horse communicating in the wordless language that predated human speech. Eli's touch remained gentle and respectful, never demanding more than Bella was willing to give, and gradually she began to lean into the contact, accepting the comfort and connection that she had been denying herself for so long. "I've never seen anything like it," Pete whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "She's been here for 2 months, and this is the first time she's let anyone touch her voluntarily." Jake watched the interaction with growing understanding of what he had really rescued from that auction house in Cedar Ridge. Eli wasn't just an unwanted child who needed a home. He was a boy with genuine gifts, natural abilities that had been overlooked and dismissed by people who only saw his inability to speak rather than recognizing his other forms of communication. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the peaceful scene as Cookie rode up on his sturdy pinto pony, a broad grin splitting his weathered face. "Thought you might want to see this," he called out, dismounting with surprising agility. For a man his age. "Just got word from town that Mary Sullivan is planning to ride out here this afternoon. Says she heard Jake brought home a boy who might benefit from some schooling." The mention of schooling sent a complicated mix of emotions through Eli's chest. He had observed the town children attending classes in Cedar Ridge, had watched through windows as they learned to read and write in cipher, but such opportunities had never been available to someone in his position. The idea that he might be included in such activities, that someone might consider him worthy of education, was both thrilling and terrifying. Jake noticed the change in Eli's expression and correctly interpreted its meaning. "Mary Sullivan is the schoolteacher in Cedar Ridge," he explained gently. "One of the finest women I've ever had the privilege of knowing, and someone who believes every child deserves a chance to learn, regardless of their circumstances." Sam chuckled and shook his head. "Miss Mary doesn't take no for an answer when it comes to education. If she's decided Eli needs schooling, then schooling he'll get, whether he wants it or not." The afternoon brought Mary Sullivan riding into the ranch yard on a spirited black mare, her proper riding habit somehow managing to look both practical and elegant, despite the dust of the mountain trails. She was a woman in her 30s with intelligent brown eyes, dark hair pinned back in a neat chignon, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of managing classrooms full of energetic children. Eli watched from his position by the corral as she dismounted and greeted Jake with obvious warmth and respect. There was something about her manner, about the way she carried herself and spoke to the ranch hands as equals, that suggested she was different from most of the adults he had known. "Jake Thompson," she said, removing her riding gloves with practiced efficiency. "I hear you've added a new member to your household. I hope you don't mind my presumption in coming out here uninvited, but when I heard about the boy, I felt I had to meet him." Jake smiled and gestured toward the corral where Eli stood with Bella, the mare now allowing him to stroke her neck and shoulders with gentle confidence. "Mary, I'd like you to meet Eli Carter. Eli, come over here and meet Miss Sullivan. She's the finest teacher in the Colorado Territory, and I suspect she's got some ideas about your education." Eli approached slowly, his natural caution warring with curiosity about this woman whose reputation had preceded her. Mary Sullivan waited patiently for him to reach them, then extended her hand in the same courteous manner that Jake and his men had used. "Hello, Eli," she said, her voice warm, but not condescending. "I'm Mary Sullivan, and I teach school in Cedar Ridge. I've heard wonderful things about you from the people in town, and I was hoping we might become friends." The reference to wonderful things confused Eli, who couldn't imagine what positive reports might have emerged from his time in Cedar Ridge. Mary seemed to read his puzzlement and smiled gently. "Oh yes, there are definitely people talking about you. Mrs. Davis at the boarding house mentioned how polite you were when Mr. Thompson brought you there for new clothes. The stable boy at Morrison's said you helped him calm a spooked horse just by standing near it. And several people commented on how you helped that little girl with the cough at the auction house, making sure she didn't fall when she was weak." Each example hit Eli like a small revelation. He had performed these actions without thought, responding instinctively to situations where help was needed, but he had never considered that anyone had noticed or that such small kindnesses might be remembered and discussed. Mary continued, her voice taking on the gentle authority of someone accustomed to encouraging reluctant students. "I believe that every child has the right to learn, Eli, regardless of their circumstances or their ability to communicate in traditional ways. Reading and writing aren't just about speaking words aloud, they're about understanding ideas, exploring new worlds, and developing the tools to think clearly about complex problems." She paused, studying Eli's face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years reading the expressions and body language of children. "I'd like to work with you, if you're willing. We can start with basic reading and arithmetic, see what interests you most, and develop a program of study that fits your particular strengths and needs." The offer hung in the air like a bridge to a future Eli had never dared to imagine. Education represented possibilities beyond anything he had previously considered: the ability to read books, to understand the written word, to participate in the larger world of ideas and knowledge. Jake placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. "The choice is yours, son. Miss Sullivan is offering you something valuable, but it's up to you whether you want to accept it." Eli looked around the circle of faces watching him, Jake's encouraging smile, Mary's patient expectation, Sam's approving nod, and even Cookie's gruff but supportive expression. For the first time in his life, he was being offered choices rather than being told what he must do, and the weight of that freedom was both liberating and overwhelming. Slowly, carefully, he nodded his head in acceptance, and the smile that spread across Mary Sullivan's face was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Wonderful!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands together with genuine delight. "We'll start tomorrow if that's acceptable to everyone. I'll bring some basic primers and see what level we should begin with." As the afternoon progressed and plans were made for Eli's education, he found himself experiencing a sensation he had no name for: the feeling of belonging. of being valued and wanted for who he was, rather than what he could provide through his labor. The ranch hands continued to include him in their conversations. Mary Sullivan asked his opinions about subjects he might want to study, and Jake treated him with the same respect and consideration he showed his adult employees. But it was his ongoing relationship with Bella that provided the most profound satisfaction. Throughout the day, he returned repeatedly to the corral, spending time with the Mare, who seemed to find in his presence the same kind of peace and acceptance that he found in hers. By evening, she was allowing him to brush her coat and clean her hoofs, tasks that none of the ranch hands had been able to perform despite their expertise and patience. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks and the ranch settled into its evening routines, Jake found Eli sitting on the corral fence, watching Bella graze in the gathering twilight. The boy's posture was relaxed in a way that Jake had never seen before, suggesting that he was finally beginning to believe in the possibility of safety and happiness. "She's a beautiful horse," Jake said, climbing up to sit beside Eli on the fence. "And she's lucky to have found someone who understands her so well." Eli turned to look at Jake, and in his dark eyes, the rancher saw something that made his heart swell with hope and pride. It was the look of a child who was beginning to heal, who was starting to believe that the world might hold kindness as well as cruelty. The next morning brought Mary Sullivan back to the ranch, her saddlebags loaded with books, slates, and writing materials. She had set up a temporary classroom in Jake's main room, arranging chairs around the large wooden table and creating an atmosphere that was both scholarly and welcoming. Eli approached his first formal lesson with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, unsure of what would be expected of him or whether he would be able to meet Mary's standards. But as she began with simple exercises designed to assess his current knowledge, it became clear that his years of careful observation and silent listening had given him a foundation that surprised everyone, including himself. He could recognize many letters and even some simple words, knowledge gleaned from watching other children's lessons through windows and from studying the few printed materials that had been available in Cedar Ridge. His mathematical understanding was more limited but showed definite potential, and his ability to concentrate and focus was remarkable for a child his age. "This is extraordinary," Mary murmured to Jake as they watched Eli work through a reading exercise, his finger following the words with careful precision. "He's teaching himself to read by pure observation and memory. With proper instruction, he could advance very quickly." The weeks that followed established a routine that brought structure and purpose to Eli's days. Mornings were spent in lessons with Mary, who came to the ranch 3 times a week and left assignments for the days between her visits. Afternoons were devoted to ranch work, where he learned to care for the horses, help with feeding and grooming, and assist Sam and Pete with the countless tasks that kept the Circle T running smoothly. But it was his relationship with Bella that continued to provide the most profound joy and satisfaction. The Mare had become completely comfortable with his presence, seeking him out when he appeared at the corral and following him around the enclosure like a devoted dog. Under his gentle care, she began to regain the confidence and trust that her previous experiences had damaged. Pete was amazed by the progress both boy and horse were making. "Never seen anything like it," he told Jake one evening as they watched Eli leading Bella around the corral without even a halter, the Mare responding to his gestures and voice commands with perfect obedience. "It's like they're speaking the same language." Sam nodded in agreement. "The boy's got a gift, no question about it. But more than that, he's got the patience and understanding to use that gift properly. Some people can handle horses through force or dominance, but Eli works with them as partners." The transformation in Eli himself was equally remarkable. The thin, frightened child who had stood on the auction platform in Cedar Ridge was gradually being replaced by a boy who was gaining confidence in his abilities and his place in the world. He still didn't speak, but his communication through gestures, expressions, and actions had become so clear and effective that words often seemed unnecessary. Mary Sullivan was particularly impressed by his progress in reading and writing. Within weeks, he was working through materials that most children required months to master, his hunger for knowledge driving him to spend extra hours studying by lamplight in his room. "He has an exceptional mind," she told Jake during one of their regular discussions about Eli's education. "Given proper opportunities, there's no limit to what he might accomplish." "Have you given any thought to what kind of future you envision for him?" The question struck Jake with unexpected force. In the weeks since bringing Eli home, he had been focused on providing immediate care and stability, but Mary's words made him realize that he needed to think beyond the present moment. This boy who had come into his life as a purchased possession was becoming something far more significant, a son in every way that mattered. That night, as Jake sat by the fire planning for Eli's future, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The boy needed more than just a temporary home and basic education. He needed a family, a legal standing, and the security that came from knowing he truly belonged somewhere. The next morning, Jake began the process of formally adopting Eli Carter, a legal procedure that would give the boy his name, his protection, and his unconditional love for the rest of his life. The autumn winds carried news through the Colorado Territory with the efficiency of a telegraph system, and word of Jake Thompson's unusual household addition had spread far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Ridge. It was Cookie who first noticed the increased attention, observing strangers lingering near the ranch boundaries and asking pointed questions at the general store about the boy who lived at Circle T. "Something's got folks stirred up," Cookie reported to Jake one crisp October morning, his weathered face creased with concern. "Been 3 different men in town this week asking about Eli. Not casual questions either, but the kind of pointed inquiries that suggest someone's paying them to gather information." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his military instincts immediately alert to potential threats. "What kind of men? Locals looking for gossip or outsiders with specific purposes?" Sam Rodriguez appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hat dusted with snow from the early morning chores. "Saw fresh tracks along the eastern boundary yesterday," he added. "Someone's been watching the ranch, staying hidden but not hidden enough to fool someone who knows what to look for." The news sent a chill through Jake that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. During his years as a cavalry officer, he had learned to recognize the signs of trouble gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The careful surveillance, the pointed questions, the sense of being watched, all of it suggested that someone had developed an interest in Eli that went beyond mere curiosity. Pete Wilson joined the conversation, carrying a telegram that had arrived with the morning mail delivery. "This might explain some of the attention," he said grimly, handing Jake the yellow paper. "Came addressed to you, but I think it concerns all of us." Jake unfolded the telegram and read its contents with growing apprehension. The message was brief but ominous. "Heard about your boys stop very interested in arrangement. Stop arriving Cedar Ridge next week to discuss business. Stop W. Morrison." The sight of Big Bill Morrison's name on the telegram made Jake's jaw tighten. With controlled anger, he had hoped that purchasing Eli legally and removing him from Cedar Ridge would end any connection to the corrupt auction system. But Morrison's message suggested otherwise. "What's it say?" Sam asked, reading the tension in Jake's expression. Jake read the telegram aloud, and the kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the whisper of wind through the eaves. Each man understood the implications. Immediately, Morrison's arrival could only mean trouble for Eli and potentially for all of them. Cookie was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the hard edge of a man who had faced down his share of dangerous situations. "That snake Morrison's got no legal claim on the boy. You bought Eli fair and square, got all the paperwork to prove it." "Legal claims and Morrison's methods aren't necessarily the same thing," Jake replied. folding the telegram carefully. The man didn't build his fortune by respecting the law when it conflicted with his interests. Outside, they could hear the sound of Eli working with Bella in the corral, his gentle voice encouraging the mare through a series of exercises that Pete had designed to rebuild her confidence under saddle. The boy's progress with the horse had been remarkable, but more than that, his presence had brought a sense of completeness to the ranch that none of them had realized was missing. Sam moved to the window and watched Eli for a moment, his dark eyes reflecting the protective instincts of a man who had come to regard the boy as family. Whatever Morrison's planning, he's not taking Eli anywhere. That boy belongs here now, and we don't abandon family. The unanimous agreement from Pete and Cookie confirmed what Jake already knew. The ranch hand's loyalty extended far beyond their employment contracts. They had witnessed Eli's transformation from a frightened, silent child into a confident, gifted boy who contributed meaningfully to their shared enterprise. More importantly, they had seen how Jake's own life had been enriched by the boy's presence. Mary Sullivan arrived that afternoon for Eli's regular lesson, but Jake could see immediately that she carried news beyond her usual educational materials. Her expression was troubled, and she glanced frequently toward the corral where Eli worked. With Bella before joining Jake on the porch. "I've heard disturbing rumors in town," she said without preamble, settling into the wooden chair beside Jake's rocker. "People are saying that Morrison is planning to challenge Eli's placement here, claiming that the sale was invalid because the boy is different." Jake's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Different how? Mary chose her words carefully, clearly struggling with the implications of what she had heard. Morrison is apparently arguing that Eli's inability to speak makes him mentally incompetent, and therefore unable to consent to his own placement. He's suggesting that the territorial authorities should intervene and return the boy to more appropriate circumstances. The legal technicality was brilliant in its cynical manipulation of the law. By questioning Eli's mental capacity, Morrison could potentially void the sale and reclaim the boy under the guise of protecting someone who couldn't protect himself. It was exactly the kind of twisted logic that had allowed the auction system to operate in the first place. "There's more," Mary continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've also heard that Morrison has been in contact with certain officials in Denver, people who might be willing to support his claims in exchange for considerations." Jake understood immediately. Morrison wasn't just challenging Eli's placement through legal channels. He was preparing to corrupt the process itself, buying whatever support he needed to achieve his goals. The realization made Jake's military training surge to the surface, his mind automatically beginning to assess threats and plan defensive strategies. Eli appeared at that moment, having finished his work with Bella for the day. He approached the porch with the easy confidence that had replaced his former wariness, but Jake could see the boy's sharp eyes taking note of the adult's serious expressions and tense body language. "Eli," Jake said, rising from his chair, "Miss Sullivan and I need to discuss some business matters. Why don't you go help Cookie with supper preparations? I believe he mentioned something about apple pie for dessert." The boy nodded and headed toward the kitchen, but Jake noticed the backward glance that suggested Eli had sensed the underlying tension in the conversation. The child's survival instincts, honed by years of dangerous circumstances, had taught him to read adult moods and motivations with uncanny accuracy. Once Eli was safely inside the house, Mary leaned forward in her chair, her voice urgent with concern. "Jake, I've been thinking about this situation, and I believe there's a way to counter Morrison's strategy. If we can prove that Eli is not only mentally competent, but actually intellectually gifted, it would undermine the entire foundation of Morrison's claims." Jake studied her face, recognizing the determined expression of someone who had developed a plan. "What did you have in mind?" Mary reached into her satchel and withdrew a thick folder filled with papers covered in Eli's careful handwriting. I've been documenting Eli's educational progress from our very first lesson. His advancement has been extraordinary, far beyond what most children achieve in similar time frames. Look at this. She spread several papers across the small table between their chairs, revealing arithmetic problems solved with perfect accuracy, essays written in Eli's precise script, and detailed drawings that demonstrated both artistic ability and scientific observation skills. This is college-level work in some areas, Mary continued, her voice filled with professional pride and personal affection. Eli's understanding of mathematics is intuitive and sophisticated. His reading comprehension tests at the level of students twice his age, and his written communication, while obviously not supported by verbal skills, demonstrates complex thinking and emotional intelligence. Jake examined the papers with growing amazement and pride. He had known that Eli was intelligent, but seeing the evidence of the boy's intellectual capabilities laid out so systematically was both inspiring and strategically valuable. Furthermore, Mary added, I've been corresponding with educators in Denver and even back east about Eli's case. There's growing recognition among educational professionals that intelligence manifests in many different ways, and that the inability to speak doesn't necessarily indicate cognitive limitations. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and both adults looked up to see a familiar figure riding into the ranch yard. Sheriff Tom Bradley of Cedar Ridge dismounted from his tired horse with the deliberate movements of a man carrying difficult news. Jake rose to greet the sheriff, noting the grim expression on the lawman's weathered face. Sheriff Bradley had always been an honest man caught in an impossible position, trying to maintain order in a territory where legal authority was often challenged by economic interests and political corruption. Afternoon, Jake, Miss Sullivan. Bradley touched his hat brim respectfully. I'm afraid I'm not here on a social call. Got some official business that needs discussing. Jake gestured toward the empty chair beside Mary, but Bradley remained standing, his posture suggesting the formal nature of his visit. What kind of official business, Tom? Bradley reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document sealed with official territorial seals. This is a court order, Jake. Morrison filed a petition in Denver claiming that the boy you purchased was sold under false pretenses. Says the child is mentally incompetent and needs to be evaluated by territorial authorities. The words hit Jake like physical blows, but his military training helped him maintain outward composure while his mind raced through potential responses. On what grounds? Claims the boy's muteness indicates cognitive deficiency, and that he was therefore unable to consent to his own sale or placement. Bradley's voice carried the distaste of a man forced to repeat arguments he didn't personally support. Judge Morrison, no relation to Big Bill, but apparently susceptible to his influence, issued a temporary order requiring Eli to be evaluated by a territorial medical examiner. Mary Sullivan stood abruptly, her face flushed with indignation. That's absolutely ridiculous. I've been working with Eli for months, and I can provide extensive documentation of his intellectual capabilities. Bradley nodded sympathetically. I'm sure you can, Miss Sullivan, and I hope you'll be prepared to present that evidence. But in the meantime, the court order requires that Eli be brought to Cedar Ridge for examination within 72 hours. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. And if we refuse? The sheriff's expression grew even more troubled. Then I'm authorized to bring him in by force, Jake. And Morrison's already got men positioned around town, supposedly, to ensure the boy's safety during the examination process. The implication was clear. Morrison had orchestrated this entire situation to regain control over Eli, using legal technicalities and corrupt officials to achieve what he couldn't accomplish through legitimate means. The 72-hour deadline was designed to prevent Jake from mounting an effective legal defense, while Morrison's men in town ensured that any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Sam Rodriguez appeared from the barn, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand the gravity of the situation. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, and his dark eyes held the hard gleam of a man prepared for trouble. Sounds like Morrison's declaring war on this family. Sheriff Bradley shook his head wearily. I'm hoping it doesn't come to that, Sam. This is a legal matter, not a gunfight. But I'll be honest with you, Morrison's got more influence in Denver than any of us realized, and he's using every bit of it to get what he wants. Jake studied the court order, reading through the legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify the actual issues involved. Tom, you've known me for 8 years. You've seen how I run this ranch, how I treat my employees and my animals. Do you honestly believe I would harm a child or keep him here against his best interests? Bradley met Jake's eyes directly, and in that gaze Jake saw the conflict of a decent man trapped between his duty and his conscience. No, Jake, I don't believe that for a second. Everyone who's seen you and Eli together knows there's genuine affection there, and the boy's obviously thriving under your care. Then help us fight this, Mary Sullivan interjected, her voice carrying the passionate intensity of someone defending a student she had come to love. You have influence in this territory too, Sheriff. People respect your judgment and your integrity. Bradley was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options and their potential consequences. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the burden of his decision. I'll do what I can within the bounds of the law, but I can't ignore a court order. The examination has to happen. Jake nodded slowly, understanding the sheriff's position, while simultaneously beginning to formulate his own strategy. Then we'll comply with the court order, Tom, but we'll also be prepared to challenge Morrison's claims with evidence of our own. As Sheriff Bradley remounted his horse and rode back towards Cedar Ridge, Jake turned to find Eli standing in the kitchen doorway, his dark eyes wide with understanding despite not having heard the specific details of the conversation. The boy's survival instincts had taught him to recognize the signs of impending danger, and his posture reflected the wariness of someone preparing to face another upheaval in his young life. Jake walked over to Eli and knelt down so they were at eye level, his hands resting gently on the boy's shoulders. Eli, some people are questioning whether you're happy here at the ranch, whether this is the right place for you to live and grow up. We're going to have to go to town and prove to them that you belong here with us. Eli's expression shifted through several emotions: fear, confusion, and then something that looked remarkably like determination. He glanced toward the corral, where Bella waited for their evening session, then back at Jake's face, and slowly nodded his understanding. Mary Sullivan joined them, her own face set with resolve. Eli, I'm going to ask you to do something very important. I want you to write a letter, not just any letter, but one that shows exactly how intelligent and capable you are. Will you do that for me? Again, Eli nodded, and Jake could see the boy's mind already working through the implications of what was being asked of him. This wasn't just another school exercise. This was a test that would determine his entire future. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation and growing tension. Mary worked with Eli on documentation that would demonstrate his intellectual capabilities, while Jake consulted with a lawyer from Denver who specialized in territorial law. Sam and Pete quietly made their own preparations, checking weapons and mapping potential escape routes in case legal remedies proved insufficient. Cookie, meanwhile, focused on keeping Eli's spirits up with extra attention to his favorite meals and gentle encouragement about the ordeal ahead. Don't you worry about those city folks and their fancy papers, he told Eli while teaching him to make biscuits from scratch. Anyone with eyes can see you're smart as a whip and twice as good-hearted. They'd have to be blind fools not to recognize quality when they see it. On the morning they were scheduled to leave for Cedar Ridge, Jake found Eli in the corral with Bella, the boy's arms wrapped around the mare's neck in what looked like a farewell embrace. The sight struck Jake with sudden powerful emotion, the realization that this might be the last time Eli would stand in this place that had become his home. "Ready to go, son?" Jake asked softly, using the word that had become natural despite the lack of legal paperwork to support it. Eli turned to face him, and in the boy's dark eyes Jake saw not fear but something far more powerful: trust. Despite everything that had happened to him, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Eli trusted Jake to protect him and fight for him. As they loaded their horses and prepared to ride toward whatever Morrison had planned for them in Cedar Ridge, Jake made a silent promise to the boy who had changed his life so completely. Whatever it took, whatever he had to sacrifice, Eli would not be going back to the auction house. Some bonds once formed were stronger than law or corruption or the schemes of desperate men. The road to Cedar Ridge had never seemed longer, and with each mile that passed, Jake could feel the weight of an uncertain future pressing down on all of them. But he could also feel something else: the determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for with everything he had. Eli rode beside him in silence, but his posture remained straight and confident, the posture of a boy who had learned that he was valued and loved and would not give up that knowledge without a fight. Behind them, Sam and Pete rode as an unofficial escort, their presence a reminder that this family had resources and loyalties that Morrison might not have anticipated. As the familiar buildings of Cedar Ridge came into view, Jake reached over and squeezed Eli's shoulder gently. "Whatever happens in there, remember this: you are my son in every way that matters, and no court order or corrupt official is going to change that. We're going to get through this together." Eli looked up at him, and for just a moment, Jake thought he saw the boy's lips move slightly, as if he were trying to form words that had been locked inside him for so long. But the moment passed, and they rode into Cedar Ridge to face whatever challenge Morrison had prepared for them, united in their determination to preserve the family they had built together. The territorial medical examiner who arrived in Cedar Ridge was not what Jake had expected. Dr. Helena Whitmore was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions based on careful observation rather than popular opinion. Morrison had clearly expected a more malleable official, and his discomfort was evident as Dr. Whitmore set up her examination room in the back of the medical office with methodical precision. She arranged her materials with the care of a scientist preparing an important experiment, and when she spoke to Morrison, her tone was professionally cool. "Mr. Morrison, I want to be very clear about my role here," she said, adjusting her spectacles as she reviewed the court documents. "I am here to evaluate this child's mental capacity, not to validate preconceived notions about his limitations. My assessment will be based entirely on objective evidence." Morrison's smile was tight and calculating. "Of course, doctor. I'm simply concerned about the boy's welfare. Children with developmental issues require specialized care that a simple rancher might not be equipped to provide." Dr. Whitmore's expression suggested she had encountered Morrison's type before and was unimpressed by his performance. "We'll see what the evidence reveals, Mr. Morrison. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to conduct my examination without interference." Jake entered the room with Eli at his side, both of them carrying the tension of everything that hung in the balance. Mary Sullivan followed close behind, her arms full of documentation and her face set with determination. The boy's dark eyes moved constantly, assessing the new environment and the adults who would determine his future. "You must be Eli," Dr. Whitmore said, her voice warm but professional as she extended her hand. "I'm Dr. Whitmore, and I'm here to spend some time with you today. I understand you're quite accomplished in your studies." Eli shook her hand politely, his grip firm despite his obvious nervousness. Something in the doctor's manner seemed to reassure him, perhaps the absence of the false sympathy or condescension he had learned to expect from official examinations. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Sullivan," Dr. Whitmore continued, "I'll be conducting a comprehensive evaluation that will include cognitive testing, observational assessment, and review of educational materials. This process will take several hours, and I prefer to work without observers to ensure the most accurate results." Morrison stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow across the small room. "Doctor, I think it's important that you understand the gravity of this situation. This boy has been living with people who may have unrealistic expectations about his capabilities." Dr. Whitmore turned to face Morrison directly, and Jake could see steel in her gaze. "Mr. Morrison, I've been evaluating cognitive capacity for over 20 years. I'm quite capable of distinguishing between genuine ability and wishful thinking. Now, I believe you have business elsewhere." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable, and Morrison had little choice but to retreat, though his expression promised that this was far from over. Jake squeezed Eli's shoulder gently before following Mary Sullivan out of the examination room, leaving the boy alone with the woman who held his future in her hands. The waiting seemed endless. Jake paced the main street of Cedar Ridge while Mary sat on a bench outside the medical office, both of them straining to hear any sounds from within that might indicate how the examination was proceeding. Sam and Pete had positioned themselves strategically around town, keeping watch for Morrison's men while maintaining the appearance of casual visitors. Cookie had taken up residence in Martha's boarding house dining room, where his presence served the dual purpose of gathering information and ensuring that friendly ears would be available if important news needed to be passed along quickly. The old cook's network of contacts throughout the territory had proven invaluable in the days leading up to this confrontation. As the afternoon wore on, more people gathered in the street outside the medical office. Word of the examination had spread through Cedar Ridge with the efficiency of a telegraph system, and opinion seemed divided between those who supported Jake's claim to Eli and those who believed Morrison's version of events. Mrs. Helen Davis, the boarding house proprietor, made her position clear by bringing Jake and Mary fresh coffee and sandwiches while they waited. "That boy's got more sense in his little finger than Morrison has in his whole head," she declared loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Anyone with eyes can see he belongs with Mr. Thompson." But there were other voices as well, people who questioned whether a mute child could truly thrive in what they saw as an inappropriate environment. Some expressed concern about Jake's qualifications as a guardian, while others wondered aloud whether the territorial authorities shouldn't have more say in the placement of vulnerable children. Inside the examination room, Eli was experiencing something entirely new in his young life, the focused attention of an adult who was genuinely interested in understanding his capabilities rather than simply categorizing his limitations. Dr. Whitmore's approach was methodical but kind, presenting him with a series of challenges that grew progressively more complex while carefully observing his responses. She began with basic cognitive assessments, asking him to solve puzzles and complete patterns that would reveal his reasoning abilities. Eli approached each task with the careful concentration that had become his trademark, working through problems with a patience and thoroughness that impressed the experienced examiner. "Remarkable," Dr. Whitmore murmured as Eli completed a spatial reasoning test that typically challenged much older children. "You're approaching these problems with genuine mathematical thinking rather than simple trial and error." Next came the educational assessments, where Mary Sullivan's months of careful documentation proved invaluable. Dr. Whitmore reviewed Eli's written work with growing amazement, noting not just the advanced level of his academic achievement, but the creativity and insight that characterized his responses to complex questions. "This essay about the behavior of horses," she said, pointing to one of Eli's longer pieces, "demonstrates not only advanced writing skills but sophisticated understanding of animal psychology. Where did you learn to observe and analyze behavior so precisely? Eli responded by gesturing toward his eyes, and then mimicking the act of watching carefully. A simple but eloquent explanation of how his years of silent observation had taught him to read the subtle signs that others often missed. Dr. Whitmore nodded approvingly, recognizing the intelligence behind his nonverbal communication. The most challenging part of the examination came when Dr. Whitmore attempted to understand the nature and extent of Eli's verbal limitations. She approached this sensitive area with particular care, recognizing that the boy's inability to speak might stem from psychological rather than physical causes. "Eli," she said gently, "I'd like to try something with you. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to respond however feels most comfortable. You can nod, shake your head, write your answer, or even try to speak if you feel like it. There's no pressure and no wrong answers." She began with simple questions about his life at the ranch, his relationship with Jake and the other men, and his feelings about his education with Mary Sullivan. Eli's responses, though entirely nonverbal, were remarkably expressive and clear. His face lit up when discussing his work with the horses, showed genuine affection when asked about Jake, and demonstrated obvious pride when reviewing his academic achievements. But when Dr. Whitmore gently probed about his earlier life, about the circumstances that had led him to the auction house, Eli's demeanor changed noticeably. His posture became more guarded, his responses more cautious, and his eyes took on the distant look of someone revisiting painful memories. "It's all right," Dr. Whitmore said softly, recognizing the signs of trauma that she had seen in too many children over the years. "You don't have to talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. But I want you to know that sometimes, when children have been through difficult experiences, their voices can get stuck, hidden away until they feel safe enough to let them out again. I'm quite capable of distinguishing between genuine ability and wishful thinking. Now, I believe you have business elsewhere." The dismissal was polite but unmistakable, and Morrison had little choice but to retreat, though his expression promised that this was far from over. Jake squeezed Eli's shoulder gently before following Mary Sullivan out of the examination room, leaving the boy alone with the woman who held his future in her hands. The waiting seemed endless. Jake paced the main street of Cedar Ridge, while Mary sat on a bench outside the medical office, both of them straining to hear any sounds from within that might indicate how the examination was proceeding. Sam and Pete had positioned themselves strategically around town, keeping watch for Morrison's men while maintaining the appearance of casual visitors. Cookie had taken up residence in Martha's boarding house dining room, where his presence served the dual purpose of gathering information and ensuring that friendly ears would be available if important news needed to be passed along quickly. The old cook's network of contacts throughout the territory had proven invaluable in the days leading up to this confrontation. As the afternoon wore on, more people gathered in the street outside the medical office. Word of the examination had spread through Cedar Ridge with the efficiency of a telegraph system, and opinion seemed divided between those who supported Jake's claim to Eli and those who believed Morrison's version of events. Mrs. Helen Davis, the boarding house proprietor, made her position clear by bringing Jake and Mary fresh coffee and sandwiches while they waited. "That boy's got more sense in his little finger than Morrison has in his whole head," she declared loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Anyone with eyes can see he belongs with Mr. Thompson." But there were other voices as well, people who questioned whether a mute child could truly thrive in what they saw as an inappropriate environment. Some expressed concern about Jake's qualifications as a guardian, while others wondered aloud whether the territorial authorities shouldn't have more say in the placement of vulnerable children. Inside the examination room, Eli was experiencing something entirely new in his young life, the focused attention of an adult who was genuinely interested in understanding his capabilities rather than simply categorizing his limitations. Dr. Whitmore's approach was methodical but kind. presenting him with a series of challenges that grew progressively more complex while carefully observing his responses. She began with basic cognitive assessments, asking him to solve puzzles and complete patterns that would reveal his reasoning abilities. Eli approached each task with the careful concentration that had become his trademark, working through problems with a patience and thoroughness that impressed the experienced examiner. "Remarkable," Dr. Whitmore murmured as Eli completed a spatial reasoning test that typically challenged much older children. "You're approaching these problems with genuine, mathematical thinking rather than simple trial and error." Next came the educational assessments, where Mary Sullivan's months of careful documentation proved invaluable. Dr. Whitmore reviewed Eli's written work with growing amazement, noting not just the advanced level of his academic achievement, but the creativity and insight that characterized his responses to complex questions. "This essay about the behavior of horses," she said, pointing to one of Eli's longer pieces, "demonstrates not only advanced writing skills but sophisticated understanding of animal psychology. Where did you learn to observe and analyze behavior so precisely?" Eli responded by gesturing toward his eyes and then mimicking the act of watching carefully, a simple but eloquent explanation of how his years of silent observation had taught him to read the subtle signs that others often missed. Dr. Whitmore nodded approvingly, recognizing the intelligence behind his nonverbal communication. The most challenging part of the examination came when Dr. Whitmore attempted to understand the nature and extent of Eli's verbal limitations. She approached this sensitive area with particular care, recognizing that the boy's inability to speak might stem from psychological rather than physical causes. "Eli," she said gently, "I'd like to try something with you. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to respond however feels most comfortable. You can nod, shake your head, write your answer, or even try to speak if you feel like it. There's no pressure and no wrong answers." She began with simple questions about his life at the ranch, his relationship with Jake and the other men, and his feelings about his education with Mary Sullivan. Eli's responses, though entirely nonverbal, were remarkably expressive and clear. His face lit up when discussing his work with the horses, showed genuine affection when asked about Jake, and demonstrated obvious pride when reviewing his academic achievements. But when Dr. Whitmore gently probed about his earlier life, about the circumstances that had led him to the auction house, Eli's demeanor changed noticeably. His posture became more guarded, his responses more cautious, and his eyes took on the distant look of someone revisiting painful memories. "It's all right," Dr. Whitmore said softly, recognizing the signs of trauma that she had seen in too many children over the years. "You don't have to talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. But I want you to know that sometimes, when children have been through difficult experiences, their voices can get stuck, hidden away until they feel safe enough to let them out again." Something flickered in Eli's dark eyes at these words, a recognition that someone finally understood the complexity of his silence. He reached for the slate that Dr. Whitmore had provided and wrote carefully, "Voice is still here, just waiting for the right moment." Dr. Whitmore read the words with growing understanding of the remarkable child sitting before her. This wasn't a case of cognitive deficiency or developmental delay. This was a highly intelligent, emotionally complex boy whose silence represented a protective response to trauma rather than an inability to communicate. As the examination concluded, Dr. Whitmore found herself facing a decision that would affect not just Eli's future, but the broader question of how society should protect and nurture its most vulnerable children. She had seen enough in her career to recognize genuine love and appropriate care when she encountered them, and everything about Eli's demeanor suggested that he had found both at the Circle T Ranch. Outside, Jake continued his anxious pacing, while Mary sat quietly reviewing the additional documentation she had brought as backup evidence. The crowd on the street had grown larger and more vocal, with Morrison's supporters arguing loudly about the dangers of allowing defective children to remain in unsuitable placements. Morrison himself had returned with several men who looked like hired muscle rather than concerned citizens. Their presence added an element of physical intimidation to what was supposed to be a legal proceeding, and Jake found himself automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes. Sam Rodriguez approached Jake with information gathered. During his reconnaissance of the town, Morrison's got at least 8 men positioned around Cedar Ridge, he reported quietly. They're trying to look casual, but they're definitely here for more than the local scenery. The implication was clear. Morrison was prepared to use force if the legal examination didn't produce the results he wanted. Jake felt his military training surge to the surface, his mind automatically beginning to plan for various contingencies, while hoping that such preparations would prove unnecessary. The door to the medical office finally opened, and Dr. Whitmore emerged with Eli at her side. The boy's expression was difficult to read, but he moved with the same quiet confidence that had characterized his behavior at the ranch. Jake searched the doctor's face for any indication of her conclusions, but her professional demeanor revealed nothing. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Sullivan," Dr. Whitmore said formally, "I've completed my examination and will be filing my report with the territorial authorities immediately. However, I believe all interested parties should hear my preliminary findings." Morrison pushed forward through the crowd, his face flushed with anticipation. "Doctor, I trust you've confirmed the boy's limitations and the inappropriateness of his current placement?" Dr. Whitmore's expression remained professionally neutral as she responded. "Mr. Morrison, I have indeed reached definitive conclusions about Eli's capabilities and care needs." She paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. "In my professional opinion, based on comprehensive testing and evaluation, Eli Carter demonstrates cognitive abilities that place him in the superior range of intellectual functioning. His academic achievements, reasoning skills, and emotional intelligence are all remarkable for a child of any age, much less one who has endured the traumatic experiences documented in his case history." The words hit Morrison like physical blows, and Jake felt a surge of relief and vindication that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. But Dr. Whitmore wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice carrying clearly to every person in the growing crowd, "my observations indicate that Eli has formed strong, healthy attachments to Mr. Thompson and his household. The boy shows clear signs of thriving in his current environment, and I see no evidence whatsoever that would justify removing him from what appears to be an exemplary care situation." Morrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "Doctor, surely you're not suggesting that a mute child can function normally in society? The boy requires specialized intervention, professional supervision." "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Whitmore interrupted, her tone sharp with professional authority, "Eli's selective mutism appears to be a protective response to early trauma rather than any cognitive or physical limitation. Given appropriate support and continued emotional security, there is every reason to expect that his verbal communication will develop naturally over time." Jake knelt down beside Eli, his heart swelling with pride and relief at the doctor's assessment. The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed to sparkle with newfound confidence, as if Dr. Whitmore's validation had lifted a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "There's one more thing," Dr. Whitmore added, reaching into her medical bag and withdrawing an official document. "Based on my evaluation, I'm recommending immediate termination of any legal challenges to Eli's current placement. This child has found a family that loves and values him, and any disruption of that relationship would be detrimental to his continued development." Something flickered in Eli's dark eyes at these words, a recognition that someone finally understood the complexity of his silence. He reached for the slate that Dr. Whitmore had provided and wrote carefully, "Voice is still here." just waiting for the right moment. Dr. Whitmore read the words with growing understanding of the remarkable child sitting before her. This wasn't a case of cognitive deficiency or developmental delay. This was a highly intelligent, emotionally complex boy whose silence represented a protective response to trauma rather than an inability to communicate. As the examination concluded, Dr. Whitmore found herself facing a decision that would affect not just Eli's future, but the broader question of how society should protect and nurture its most vulnerable children. She had seen enough in her career to recognize genuine love and appropriate care when she encountered them, and everything about Eli's demeanor suggested that he had found both at the Circle T Ranch. Outside, Jake continued his anxious pacing, while Mary sat quietly reviewing the additional documentation she had brought as backup evidence. The crowd on the street had grown larger and more vocal, with Morrison's supporters arguing loudly about the dangers of allowing defective children to remain in unsuitable placements. Morrison himself had returned with several men who looked like hired muscle rather than concerned citizens. Their presence added an element of physical intimidation to what was supposed to be a legal proceeding, and Jake found himself automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes. Sam Rodriguez approached Jake with information gathered during his reconnaissance of the town. "Morrison's got at least 8 men positioned around Cedar Ridge," he reported quietly. "They're trying to look casual, but they're definitely here for more than the local scenery." The implication was clear. Morrison was prepared to use force if the legal examination didn't produce the results he wanted. Jake felt his military training surge to the surface, his mind automatically beginning to plan for various contingencies, while hoping that such preparations would prove unnecessary. The door to the medical office finally opened, and Dr. Whitmore emerged with Eli at her side. The boy's expression was difficult to read, but he moved with the same quiet confidence that had characterized his behavior at the ranch. Jake searched the doctor's face for any indication of her conclusions, but her professional demeanor revealed nothing. "Mr. Thompson, Miss Sullivan," Dr. Whitmore said formally, "I've completed my examination and will be filing my report with the territorial authorities immediately. However, I believe all interested parties should hear my preliminary findings." Morrison pushed forward through the crowd, his face flushed with anticipation. "Doctor, I trust you've confirmed the boy's limitations and the inappropriateness of his current placement?" Dr. Whitmore's expression remained professionally neutral as she responded. "Mr. Morrison, I have indeed reached definitive conclusions about Eli's capabilities and care needs." She paused, allowing the tension to build before continuing. "In my professional opinion, based on comprehensive testing and evaluation, Eli Carter demonstrates cognitive abilities that place him in the superior range of intellectual functioning. His academic achievements, reasoning skills, and emotional intelligence are all remarkable for a child of any age, much less one who has endured the traumatic experiences documented in his case history." The words hit Morrison like physical blows, and Jake felt a surge of relief and vindication that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. But Dr. Whitmore wasn't finished. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice carrying clearly to every person in the growing crowd, "my observations indicate that Eli has formed strong, healthy attachments to Mr. Thompson and his household. The boy shows clear signs of thriving in his current environment, and I see no evidence whatsoever that would justify removing him from what appears to be an exemplary care situation." Morrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "Doctor, surely you're not suggesting that a mute child can function normally in society? The boy requires specialized intervention, professional supervision." "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Whitmore interrupted, her tone sharp with professional authority, "Eli's selective mutism appears to be a protective response to early trauma rather than any cognitive or physical limitation. Given appropriate support and continued emotional security, There is every reason to expect that his verbal communication will develop naturally over time. Jake knelt down beside Eli, his heart swelling with pride and relief at the doctor's assessment. The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed to sparkle with newfound confidence, as if Dr. Whitmore's validation had lifted a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "There's one more thing," Dr. Whitmore added, reaching into her medical bag and withdrawing an official document. "Based on my evaluation, I'm recommending immediate termination of any legal challenges to Eli's current placement. This child has found a family that loves and values him, and any disruption of that relationship would be detrimental to his continued development." The crowd erupted in the sear of cheers and angry protests, but Jake heard none of it. His entire attention was focused on Eli, who had stepped closer and was looking up at him with an expression of such trust and affection that it took Jake's breath away. And then, in a voice so soft that only Jake could hear it, Eli whispered a single word that changed everything: "Papa." The sound was barely audible, just a whisper of breath shaped into the most important word in any language. But Jake heard it clearly, felt it resonate through his entire being like a bell tolling in a cathedral. This boy, who had been silent for so long, had found his voice at the moment when it mattered most. Jake's eyes filled with tears as he pulled Eli into his arms, holding him close while the crowd continued to argue around them. Morrison was shouting something about appeals and higher authorities, but his words seemed to come from a great distance, muffled by the overwhelming reality of what had just occurred. "I love you too, son," Jake whispered back, and this time several people nearby heard the word son and understood its significance. Mary Sullivan was crying openly, while Sam and Pete grinned with the fierce pride of men who had just witnessed their family officially recognized and protected. Dr. Whitmore approached Jake and Eli with a warm smile that transformed her professional demeanor entirely. "Mr. Thompson, I believe this young man has something he'd like to say to you." Eli looked up at Jake again, and this time his voice was stronger, more confident, as he said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "Thank you, Papa, for bringing me home." The words carried across the street, silencing even Morrison's protests, as people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a legal victory or a bureaucratic decision. This was a child finding his voice, literally and figuratively, because he had finally found a place where he felt safe enough to speak. Morrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage his plans, appealing to Sheriff Bradley to arrest Jake for some invented charge. But the sheriff, who had watched the entire proceeding with growing disgust for Morrison's tactics, simply shook his head. "Morrison, the doctors made her ruling, and that's the end of it. The boy stays with Thompson, and if you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with the territorial governor. But you're not taking that child anywhere today." As the crowd began to disperse and Morrison retreated with his hired men, Jake found himself surrounded by friends and supporters who had witnessed Eli's remarkable breakthrough. But all of that seemed secondary to the miracle of hearing his son's voice for the first time, of knowing that the scared, silent boy from the auction house had finally found the courage to speak his heart. The ride back to Circle T Ranch was triumphant, with Eli chattering quietly about everything he saw along the trail, his first extended conversation in years flowing like water that had been dammed up too long. His voice was soft and somewhat hoarse from disuse, but it carried the clear intelligence and gentle nature that Jake had always known existed beneath the silence. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing Cookie's celebratory feast, Jake watched Eli tell in Sam and Pete about his examination with Dr. Whitmore, his words careful but confident. The transformation was remarkable, but what struck Jake most was how natural it seemed, as if Eli had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal this part of himself. Later, as Jake tucked Eli into bed in the room that would always be his, the boy looked up with this serious expression that had become so familiar. "Papa," Eli said, still marveling at the sound of the word. Dr. Whitmore told me that sometimes people's voices get lost when bad things happen, but they come back when they feel safe again. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, his heart full of love for this remarkable child who had changed his life so completely. "Is that what happened to you, son?" Eli nodded solemnly. My voice was hiding, waiting for someone who would listen with their heart instead of just their ears. "I knew you were that person from the very first day, but it took time for my voice to be brave enough to come out." As Jake kissed his son goodnight and turned down the lamp, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had thought he was simply rescuing a child from a terrible situation, but in reality, Eli had rescued him just as much, filling his life with purpose and love he had never known he was missing. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood silhouetted against a star-filled sky, their peaks crowned with early snow that promised the coming winter. But inside the warm safety of Circle T Ranch, a father and son slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had found each other and that nothing would ever separate them again. The legend of the mute orphan boy who found his voice became a story told throughout the territory for generations, inspiring other families to look beyond surface appearances and recognize the potential that exists in every child. But for Jake Thompson and Eli Carter, it was simply the beginning of a lifetime of love, learning, and the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you truly belong somewhere in this vast and sometimes difficult world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.